All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Av, Paul and Kathy Pollack, in honor of their grandchildren, Tikva, Esther, Simcha, Abigail, Milana, Melisenta. May they grow to become the best version of themselves. The Daf Yomi Shir and the Schus of Refuah Shlema for Yehuda ben Michal. Our week of learning sponsors, Jeff and Karen Cohn, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Karen's mother, Clara Axman. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamos Lav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, and all those who require a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. So with that, let us begin. We have a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Mem Beis 42. We are picking up on Mem Aleph on Mem Beis, just a few lines shy of the end of the parak. And we left off, let's pick up with, right before the parak ends, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, about 12 lines up before the parak ends. So remember again, we ended off yesterday with a very important conclusion, with the Gemara telling us that Chatzi Nezek, half damages, is in fact a knas. Remember again, that was the machlokas. That was the dispute that we were really hyper-focused on throughout yesterday's daf. Is the half, remember again, Chatzi Nezek is paid in a situation when my ox is a first-time offender. So my ox scores Ruvain's ox, again, first-time offender, halacha lamaisa, the halacha tells me that I pay Chatzi Nezek, half damages. Ultimately, again, is that a monetary payment or is it a penalty payment? Is it mamon or is it knas? And remember again, based on yesterday's daf, we saw what's the nafkamina, what's the practical difference if it's mamon or knas? What's the nafkamina? Can you pay based on your own admission? Remember again, if it's knas, the concept of knas that we saw also in yesterday's daf, very important principle. By the way, I want to point out, this is why Kesuvos is called Shas Katan. Kesuvos is called the mini Shas because the truth is, there are so many Talmudic concepts embedded in this one Gemara. You just look at yesterday's daf. So again, we've got the concept of Modeh b'knas pater, that if you admit that you're obligated to a penalty payment, you are pater. You are pater. That's based on the Agzeres Akasa. That's based on a pasuk. Right now, again, so therefore, whether or not Chatzi Nezek is knas or mamon is incredibly important. It's not just like an academic classification. At the end of the day, whether or not it's knas or mamon will drive whether or not I could self-incriminate. So we go back and forth. But halacha l'maaseh, the Gemara ended off. This is what we ended off with in yesterday's daf. Is that Chatzi Nezek, half damages, which is the payment paid for a first-time offending ox, is knas, is penalty, is a penalty payment, and therefore halacha l'maisa, ultimately, again, if I go ahead and admit it of my own volition, I am pater. As a result of that, the Gemara says, "V'hashta da'amrit palginiska knasa." Now that we've established that Chatzi Nezek is a knas, hai kalba da'achel imri. This is interesting. A dog that eats a sheep. Now, if you look at Rashi says something interesting. The achal imri shechanak talaim chayim va'achlam. If you have a dog that strangled the sheep, and ate the sheep, or we see why this case is important in just a moment. Or shunra the achal tarnagoli ravravi, or you have a cat that ate a very large chicken, or a very large rooster. Rashi says over here, not yet. What's the halacha? Mishunahi. Now we'll say these are considered to be abnormal cases. If you take a look at Rashi, Mishunahu ein darko b'kach. Apparently, dogs don't strangle sheep, and cats, when they attack chickens or roosters, will attack smaller ones, not larger ones. So I will say again, these are Baba Kama concepts over here. This is called a deviant act of damages, right? Deviant damages. If you look at Rashi, Mishunahu ein darko b'kach. A dog doesn't damage in this way. A cat doesn't damage in this way. Now, why is this important? The chol nezek mishuna behema. We'll say anytime an animal damages in an abnormal fashion, have tolda de keren tama. Sha'af hu mishuna de indarka b'kach v'chatzi nezek hu d'mishalim. So we'll say, okay, so just one more piece of avakam over here. There's a concept of Karen, and animal damages in different ways. So, for example, we saw yesterday the concept of regel. Regel means when an animal causes damage just in the course of its activities of daily living. There's no aggressive behavior. Remember again, we saw in yesterday's daf, the animal is walking, kicks up pebbles, the pebbles go ahead and damage someone else's utensil. So that's called tsroros de regel. But the idea is the animal's just walking, the animal's minding its own business, but it caused damage. Karen refers to aggressive animal behaviors which cause damage. So I will say, here you have a case of Karen Mishuna, where the animal is damaging, but the animal is damaging in an abnormal way. A dog doesn't normally strangle a sheep. A cat doesn't normally attack large roosters or chickens. So here it's an aggressive act, that's called Karen, but it's abnormal. So again, without getting into all the details, but abnormal Karen is kind of treated in halacha like a first-time offending goring ox, right? And therefore halacha l'maisa, subject to chatzi nezek. Okay, subject to chatzi nezek. So we'll say, so you're going to see why the Gemara is bringing up this case. So this is a case over here of halacha l'maisa, where I'm going to be chayiv. It's really a fascinating case. I'm chayiv chatzi nezek. Therefore, again, the Gemara says, v'lo magbinam bebavel, and we would not collect such damages in Bavel. And I will say, why not? This is incredible. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, actually not yet, sorry. V'lo magbinam bebavel. Aval zutre, again, we'll see what I'll say, in Bavel, they collected mammon, they didn't collect knas. Meaning what? And this is really quite fascinating, that knas, we're going to see, requires a beis din that has smicha. Smicha is an unbroken chain of ordination going back to Moshe Rabbeinu. Without formal smicha, a beis din can collect mammon. They can collect monetary compensation. They can't collect knas. So the Gemara says, however, aval zutri orchehu, but if a dog kills, right, the dog kills a sheep in a normal way, or the cat goes ahead and kills a chicken or a rooster that's smaller, that's normal, umagbinon. And ultimately, again, such damages you can collect even in Batei Din in Bavel. Apparently, the courts in Bavel did not have dayanim who had smicha. They were talmidei chachamim, but they didn't have this formal smicha. Therefore, in Bava, they could not collect knas. Pretty incredible. Pretty incredible. Rashi, if you look at Rashi, by the way, Rashi says, it's the first wide line in Rashi, middle of the line, v'chevon deknasahu lo magbinan le b'dayane Bavel. So because it's a knas, you can't collect this with dayanim in Bavel. She'ein sham smicha b'zikenim. V'lo mikru mumchim. V'gabe knas ksiv yashin alakim. Okay, I will say, we're not going to get into these technicalities right now, but the Gemara sensitizes us to this idea that you could only collect knas with a beis din that has smicha. So in Bavel, the Batei Din did not have normative smicha, regular smicha, or I should say classic smicha. Therefore, they couldn't collect knas payments, but they could collect mammon. So the Gemara says, however, v'itafas lo mafkinon minei. He'll say, this is actually fascinating. There's a concept in halacha sometimes that a beis din can't enforce a particular claim. But if the claimant seizes property, right? Let's say the plaintiff seizes property of the defendant, beis din would not extract that property. So just to illustrate this over here, let's play this out. My dog goes ahead and chokes. Right, my cat attacks Reuven's large chicken. That's mishuna. That's considered to be deviant behavior. Now, what kind of deviant behavior? As we saw before, it's keren mishuna. What's the halacha for keren mishuna? Chatzi nezek. Chatzi nezek is a knas. Good. Chatzi nezek is knas. Because it's knas, therefore what? It cannot be collected in Bavel. It's incredible. Why can't it be collected in Bavel? Because in Bavel, they didn't have smicha. And you can only collect knas with smicha. So we have an interesting case over here. Everyone knows my chicken did it. I'm sorry, my cat did it. Right? Everyone knows my cat did it. Beis Din is just simply powerless to go ahead and enforce this knas. Well, if Ruvain were to come over to my house, come into my garage, and take my snowblower, because this was his prize, fair winning chicken. He brought this chicken to the fair every year. And this one, and the chicken was worth $500. So he takes my snowblower, which is worth 5,000. If I say 5,500 or whatever it is, right? He takes my snowblower, which is the same amount of money. Beis Din would not extract the snowblower from Ruvain. Interesting case, because Beis Din knows that Reuven is entitled to it. But Lamaisa, they're powerless to go and enforce this claim because they don't have smicha. Okay. V'i amar ekavel zimna le'eretz Yisrael. And I will say, if Reuven were to say, listen, fine, so let's make a court date in Eretz Yisrael. We'll go to Eretz Yisrael, because in Eretz Yisrael, the Batei Din there had, the Dayanim have smicha, and they'll be able to enforce the knas. Then mekav inon lei. Then we make a time. In other words, then Beis Din will force me, the defendant, to go ahead and go up to Eretz Yisrael to have the case heard there. I will say, since in Bavel we can't adjudicate this properly, if the plaintiff says, I want to go to Eretz Yisrael to have the case heard, Beis Din will force me, the defendant, to go to Eretz Yisrael. We'll say Rabbi Nachman says on this statement something so beautiful. He says that there's a deeper meaning in this phrase. The Amar ikaveli zimna le'eretz Yisrael. If a Jew says, I need to get to Eretz Yisrael. If a Jew says, I need to have my time to get to Eretz Yisrael. The Rebbe is not talking about for a visit. He's not talking about for a vacation. But if a Jew feels in his heart that my place is in Eretz Yisrael, my place is there. Ikaveli zimna le'eretz. I need to establish my time where I could build my life in Eretz Yisrael. Mikavin le. Ultimately, again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will help him get there. If the Jew truly desires to truly be in Eretz Yisrael with all of his essence, to make his kaviyos there, kaviyos means like an established permanent presence, to make his kaviyos there, ikavele. Kadosh Baruch Hu will give him the siyata d'shmaya to make that happen. It's a beautiful idea. And again, if the defendant refuses to go to Eretz Yisrael, ultimately we excommunicate him. Benkach mishamtin alei. Now this is very interesting. The truth is we excommunicate him either way. Why? The amrin alei salik hezekach. Because I will say, here's the problem. In both of these cases, what's the problem? I'm maintaining a vicious dog, or I'm maintaining a vicious cat. And the halacha is that Beis Din puts pressure on a person to not possess things which could damage other people. Mid Rabbi Nassan. So Rabbi Nassan is the sign of Rabbi Nassan. Omer minayin shlo yigad adam kelev rabbi soch beiso. How do we know that a person should not raise a bad dog in their home? In other words, I will say that a person shouldn't raise an animal that has the ability to do damage to others in their home. Similarly, below ya'amid sulam ra'ua b'soch beiso, or a person should not go ahead and maintain a rickety ladder. A rickety ladder is a ladder that could collapse if somebody tries to scale it. How do you know this? Shne'emar v'lo sasim damim b'veisecha. Because the pasuk says, do not let there be blood in your home. In other words, I will say, so what the Gemara is saying over here is, there's like multiple levels over here, right? So if it's because it's chatzin nezek, therefore it's a knas. Beis Din in Bavel, who doesn't have smicha, can't hear the case. Okay, but if Ruvain ends up seizing some of my property to satisfy his loss, Beis Din will not extract it from him. And if Ruvain says, "Make me a court date in Eretz Yisrael," Beis Din will force me to go. And if I don't go, Beis Din excommunicates me. And then the Gemara says, by the way, Beis Din is going to excommunicate me regardless until I remedy the issue. And what's ultimately, again, remedying the issue? What's remedying the issue? Remedying the issue is removing the source of danger. So whether it's the vicious dog, the violent cat, or the rickety ladder, Beis Din orders me ultimately to go ahead and remove that. I will say there's a beautiful piece on Minayin Shlo Yigad Adam Kelevra, but we'll save it. We'll get a little bit further in the daf, and then we'll come back in Meretz Hashem and do that. Hadjun Aloch Elu Naras Rabosai Shkoyach Mazel Tov Nara Shenis Pasasa. Shabosai, a girl who was seduced. Boshto Pagamo Knasa Shalavia. So remember, we've established this already. Her boshes, humiliation, Pagam depreciation, Knas is the penalty payment, belongs to her father. Vahatsar bitfusa. And ultimately, we'll say, now again, if there's tsar, now remember, when is there tsar? Tsar doesn't apply in the case of mafuta, right? There's no tsar in seduction. Tsar is only by ones. So the Mishnah just says, by the way, and if there's tsar, i.e. a case of ones, that goes to her father. Okay. Amda bedin. I both say now we get into some of the interesting cases here. Amda bedin. So I both say, let's say now again, Ruvain seduced Rachel. Ruvain seduced Rachel. And now what happens? So there's a court proceedings. Remember again, this is a din Torah. This is a din Torah. Because Bepashtos, Ruvain is not admitting to what it is that he did. So Amda bedin, if ultimately they began the court proceedings, Ad Shalom Sa'av. So let's say they began the court proceedings, the father is still alive, Harehin Shalav. So as we just said before, all of the financial awards, so to speak, that Beis Din awards Rachel really go to her father. Meis Ha'av, what happens if halacha l'maisa the father dies? Harehin shal achin. Ultimately, again, then the awards, so to speak, go to her brothers. Now, both say what that means is if the father dies, then halacha l'maisa, the money that he would have been entitled to passes on to his heirs as inheritance. So assuming that she has brothers, these financial awards of Boshes, Pegam, Knas, ultimately again will go on to her brothers. Okay. Lo ispika la'amod bedin ad shemei sa'av. So this is an interesting case. We'll say what happens if halacha l'maisa, right? Reuven violates Rachel or seduces Rachel, whichever case it is, and they're going to take the case to Beis Din. But before the case comes to Beis Din, so Rachel's father dies. So lo ispika la'amod bedin ad shemei sa'av harehin shalatzma. In that case, then halacha l'maisa, the girl keeps all of the money, right? Rachel gets all of the financial settlement. Look at Rashi. Lo hispika la'amod bedin. Rashi says, third to last line from the bottom. Kevin de lo amda bedin lav mamonhu. See, I was saying, since the court proceedings did not begin, the award is not considered to belong to the father. Lahorisha labanav. See, I was saying, here's what's interesting. If it seems to be from the Mishnah that if the court proceedings began and the father died after they had begun, so we view the awards as already having belonged to the father before he died, and therefore they'll pass through to the inheritors. However, if the father died before the court proceedings began, then the father really has no rights in that money. Because he has no rights in the money, they don't pass through to the inheritors. So where does the money go? The money remains with Rachel. Good. Another interesting case. Let's say halacha l'maisa, they begin the court proceedings before she becomes a bogeres. Harehin shalav, then ultimately the awards will go to the father. Meis ha'av, if the father dies, harehin shalachin, then ultimately they'll pass through to the inheritors. Lo ispika la'amod bedin ad shebagra, harehin shalatzma. Now, both say this last case is very interesting. We've actually alluded to this already. Right? Reuven violates Rachel. Obviously, again, in order for there to be a knas, right? What stage is Rachel in? What is she in? She's in Nara. She's in Nara. So now let's say by the time the Beis Din gets a chance to hear the case, she's what? She's a bogeres. She's a bogeres. So in that case, the award belongs to her. She's a bogeres already. Rabbi Shimon Omer, im lo yispika ligbos ad shemei sa'av, harein shalatzma. So I will say it's actually very interesting. Rabbi Shimon has a different model. So I will say, up until now, the Tanakama of the Mishnah understands that as long as the legal proceedings began and the father was alive, any financial settlements belong to who? The father. So that even if the father died before the verdict was delivered, the awards are considered to belong to the father, and then they'll pass through to the inheritors. Rabbi Shimon disagrees. Rabbi Shimon says, Im lo hispika ligbos ad shemei sa'av harehin shalatzma. So it's very interesting. Rabbi Shimon says the only time that the awards from Beis Din belong to the father is when? When he actually had possession of them, when he collected them. But halacha l'maisa, even if the father was alive for the proceedings, and even if the father was alive for the verdict, if the father did not collect the money's not his. And because it's not his, it doesn't pass through to the inheritors upon his death. Rather, again, if he dies before actual collection, who gets the money? Rachel. Rashi says over here, last Rashi in the Daf, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Afa pi sha'am bedin lo havi mamon da'av lo harisha labanav ademati liyadei. So we'll say this is the position of Rabbi Shimon. The money, the awards, does not belong to the father until the father actually collects it. So if the father dies any time before collection, the money belongs to Rachel and does not pass through to the inheritor. So we'll say a fundamental machlokes. So again, I just want to point out once more what this machlokes is because this is dramatic. So you've got the Tanakama saying that the only time the money, there will be two cases where the money will belong to her, according to the Tanakama. Case number one is where she becomes a bogeres even before the court proceedings begin, which makes sense. And case number two is where the father died before the court proceedings began. But essentially, if the father is alive at the time the court proceedings begin, even if he dies before the verdict, the money is considered, the award, we'll call it, the awards are considered to be the possession of the father. Now the father's dead, so what'll happen? It'll pass through, the Mishnah calls it to her brothers, meaning it'll pass through to the father's inheritors. Rabbi Shimon says, no, the money only belongs to the father when it actually comes into his possession. If the father doesn't take possession, so it doesn't matter when he died, if he didn't take possession, the money's not his. So if he dies any time before he actually takes possession, so in other words, let's say the Beis Din delivered the verdict, but ultimately, again, he just didn't take possession, halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Shimon will say it belongs to the girl, belongs to Rachel. Top of Membeis, Rabbi will say, top of Membeis. So the Gemara said, Maisi Adem Misyasa Afa Bishla Gavsa, Meisa Av Harin Shla Achin. Her earnings, that's Maisi Adem, her earnings, Mitziyasa, that which she finds, we'll see exactly what that case is. Afa Bishla Gavsa, even though they have not yet been collected, Meisa Av Harin Shla Achin. So we'll say, this case, what the Gemara seems to be saying is like this, that Allah Chalamaisa, if you have a situation where she earned money during her father's lifetime. Now remember again, earnings that her earnings technically belong to her father. So if she earned money during her father's lifetime, even though she didn't yet collect it, those are considered to be the possession of the father. And therefore, again, when the father dies, those earnings will pass through to the heirs. Okay, so we'll say, we'll analyze those cases separately. So we'll say, so here's the problem. The opening part of the Mishnah seems to be totally redundant. We've learned this already. Namely, what does the opening part of the Mishnah say? It says that a girl who is seduced, her boshes, pegam, and kanas go to her father. So the Gemara says, "My kamash balon." What's the chiddush in that? Tanina, we've learned this already. Hamefate nosin shlosha dvarim. Right, the seducer pays three buckets of money. Right, three things. Va'onis arba. And the violator pays 4. Hamefata no same boshes upegamu kinas. So ultimately, the seducer pays boshes pegam and kinas. Mosef alav ones. Ultimately, again, the ones will pay one more item. Shenosin esatzar. And also, so why does the Mishnah need to go ahead and repeat this concept? To which the Gemara says, la'avia it's darichle. No, the Mishnah needs to tell me that you pay it to the father. Pay to the father. La'avia nami pshita. We learned that already also, that you pay to the father. Midikayoyev mifata. Now, I'll say, here's what's interesting. This is fascinating. It's obvious that these payments are made to the father. How do you know they're made to the father, I'll say? The case of mefata teaches me that this is made to the father. Why? Because Rabbi say, if it wasn't made to the father, there should be no payments for mefata. Why should there be no payments for mefata? Why not? Because it's consensual. In other words, Rabbi say, I know it sounds very strange to us about consensual with a girl who's 12 and a half years old, right? They're 12 years old. Doesn't make it, all right. But again, obviously, we've said this a million times already. The Gemara is obviously just operating with a fundamentally different societal model. But the point the Gemara is making over here is, this obvious that the payments go to the father, because if it's going to her, in the case of mefata, why should she be entitled to anything? This was a consensual act, to which the Gemara says, so we'll say, no. You're right. The entire point of the Mishnah, we'll say, essentially, the entire beginning of the Mishnah was really redundant. And it really was, I shouldn't say redundant. It was an introduction. What was it an introduction to? The case of Amda Badin. I will say, the meat of this Mishnah is the machlokes, Rabbi Shimon and Tanakama, as to when the father really becomes entitled to the awards of this particular case. So, Amda Badin Itzrichale, Plukta de Rabbi Shimon v'Rabbanan. Really what this Mishnah Rabosai is here to introduce us to is the machlokes Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanan Rabosai. So once again, the Gemara now tells me the entire really first part of the Mishnah was really just an intro. What's the essence of this Mishnah? What's the meat of this Mishnah? The meat of this Mishnah Rabosai is a machlokes of when a father becomes entitled to the compensation awarded to his daughter. When does a father become entitled? The Rabbanan say, as long as a father is alive at the beginning of the court proceedings, he is considered to be in possession, so to speak, of the awards. So that even if he dies before verdict, ultimately, again, those awards will pass through to his heirs. Rabbi Shimon says, no. Father is only in possession of the awards when he actually gets possession of it. Any time beforehand, ultimately it'll belong to the girl. The Gemara says that's the essence of this Mishnah. So let's analyze. So Tanan Hasam, we learned Anasto upasitas biti. But listen to this case, right? Reuven goes over to Shimon, and he says, Shimon, you went ahead, or I should say, Shimon goes over to Reuven, and he says, Reuven, you went ahead and you seduced or you violated my daughter. And Reuven says, no, I didn't. So Shimon, the father, now says, Mashpi acha ani, I want you to swear that you did not violate my daughter, you didn't seduce my daughter. V'amar amen. And Reuven says amen, which means I will say what? Reuven takes a shvuah. Reuven swears that he did not go ahead and seduce Rachel, who is Shimon's daughter. V'achar kach hoda, and then Reuven admits that he did. Right, that he did. So we'll say now two things have happened. What are the two things that have happened? Number one, Reuven seduced Rachel. That's number one. And number two, he took a false oath. He swore falsely. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Chayiv. Now, what are you chayiv here? Take a look at Rashi. Chayiv, it's in the short lines of Rashi, about 4 lines in Chayiv. Keren, so we'll say, he's chayiv Keren. I will say, in this case, what does Keren mean? Keren just means whatever regular monetary compensation. So I will say, let's say in a case of seduction, that's going to be the knas, boshes, and pegam. Right? Knas, boshes, pegam. So the Gemara says, so he's going to be chayiv. So that's Keren, v'chomesh. I will say, when you swear falsely, you're also chayiv a penalty fifth, an additional fifth, right? So there's chomesh, v'asham, and a carbon asham. Right? And a carbon asham. So I will say asham gzelos, Rashi says. So these are the 3 things you're going to be chayiv. Number 1, well, let's work backwards. An asham gzelos, right? An asham gzelos. Number 2, Karen, which means all of the buckets of payment, plus chomesh, an additional penalty fifth. Rabbi Shimon poter. Rabbi Shimon says you're pater. Why does Rabbi Shimon say you're pater? Sheinu m'shalin knas al pi atzmo. Rabbi Shimon says because halacha l'maisa, this is a case of seduction. And remember, seduction has knas. And even though now Reuven's admitting that he lied, that he swore falsely, he's admitting that he owes a knas. Rabbi will say, what's the halacha when you admit, what's the halacha mode b'knas when you admit that you owe a knas? What's the halacha? Pater. This is yesterday's daf. Mode b'knas, pater. Therefore, Rabbi Shimon says he's pater from everything. There's no asham gazelos, there's no karen, there's no chomesh, there's no nothing. So it's pretty incredible. Rashi says over Shenim B'Shalim Knas Al Pi Atzmo Ela Pi Edim V'Kevan De'ilu Odi LeKaman Kishatavu Hava Miftar Ki Karfrei Nami Ein Shavuas Kfiras Mammon. Rabbi Shimon says, since if Reuven were to admit this whole thing of his own volition, he would be pater. Therefore, even in this case over here, halacha l'maisa, when he goes ahead and he swears falsely, and then he admits that he swore falsely, he's going to be pater as well. Amru lo. So listen to this. So the Rabbanan said back to Rabbi Shimon, okay, but Knas is only one part of this. In other words, Knas is only one part of this penalty payment. It's only one part of this payment. There's also mammon, right? Remember again, Boshes and Pegam is not Knas. Boshes and Pegam is mammon. That's compensatory damages. So what about that? So the Gemara says, so that's the machlokes. That's the machlokes. So the Gemara says, ba Abai mirabo. So Abai asked Chalikasha Rabba, Homer lechavero anasto upasitas biti v'hemaraticha bedin v'nischayavta li mamon. Okay, so we'll say a little bit of a wrinkle on the previous case. Shimon comes over to Reuven. Shimon says to Reuven, you went ahead and violated my daughter. You violated my daughter. I took you to Beis Din, and Beis Din found you guilty. So pay up. So pay up. And what happens? V'hu omer, lo anasti v'lo pasiti v'lo amaritani bidin v'lo nischayafti l'cha mamon. And Reuven says, not true. I didn't violate your daughter. We never went to Beis Din, and I don't owe you anything. So v'nishba, and then Reuven swore that in fact he didn't do any of these things. And then v'hoda, now he admitted. So now Reuven goes and admits, I lied. In other words, I did all of those things. I violated your daughter. We went to Beis Din. I was found guilty, and I owe you this money. Rabbi say this is fascinating. So now, the Rabbi Shimon Mai. Rabbi say Rabbi Shimon said in the previous case, if you remember what, that even when Reuven admits that he lied, and he swore falsely, Rabbi Shimon says that what's the halacha? He's pater. Why? Because Rabbi Shimon looks at this as a case of moda b'knas. He's admitting a fine. And moda b'knas pater. So Gemara says something fascinating. Rabbi says something fascinating. What about this case? Rabbi Shimon Mai. Kevan da'amad bedin mamona havi u'mechayiv alei karbon shvua or dilma afagav da'amad bedin knas havi. Rabbi said, listen to this fascinating question. See, in case number two, Rabbi you've seen the two cases. In case number one, Shimon's confronting Reuven that he did something. Reuven is denying that he did it and swearing falsely. Then he's admitting that he did it. So he's admitting that he owes a knas. Rabbi Shimon says, okay, moved b'knas pater. You're pater. You're not chayiv anything. In case number two, what's happening over here? Reuven's confronting Shimon about two things. Number one, you violated my daughter. And number two, what? We went to Beis Din. And really, number three, Beis Din found you guilty. And you're chayiv. You're chayiv damages. So Moshe, this is a fascinating question. How do we view the verdict of Beis Din? Once Beis Din declares that Reuven is chayiv, right? So remember again, a case of violation. Let's go through this. What is Reuven going to be chayiv? So number one, knas. Next, tsar, boshes, pigam. So now that's all wrapped up into an award of Beis Din. So we'll say, listen to how fascinating this is. Once Beis Din awards the money, does the whole thing essentially become transformed into mammon? This is now a financial judgment. So we don't look at knas and mammon. It's mammon. It's now a financial judgment against Reuven. Or do we still look at it as knas as well, as knas and mammon wrapped up together? I'll say, you hear what this is? In other words, after there's a verdict of Beis Din, do we now just look at this as damages? This is mammon. This is what you owe. It's no, and after the verdict of Beis Din, right, Reuven, this is what you owe Shimon, and it's no different. So now let's say the award is $10,000. So now Beis Din declares, right, Reuven owes Shimon $10,000. So do we look at that $10,000 as no different as if Reuven had borrowed $10,000 from Shimon and he owes him money? So this is now mammon. And therefore, again, when Reuven goes in and admits that he lied, he's going to be chayiv what? Karen, all the right, the financial award, plus an additional penalty fifth, and a Hashem Gezelos. Or do we still look at the complete award as having a chilek of it that's knas? And if it's still knas, then what? Then when Reuven admits it, what's going to be the halacha? Moda b'knas pater. Such a fascinating, it's a fascinating discussion about how you look at Beis Din's financial award. Incredible. So we'll say, so Rava answered, because this is Abai asking of Rabba, sorry. Rabba answered, no. Once Beis Din passes a verdict, and now there's like a financial award, we look at that as mammon now and not knas, and therefore Reuven will be chayiv. So we'll say, Eis Rabbi Shimon raised the kasha, Eisvei, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Yochol ha'omer lechavera anasta upasitas biti. So we'll say, let's say again, Shimon goes over to Reuven, you seduced or violated my daughter. V'hu Omer, first white line, I'll say, V'hu Omer, lo anasti, v'lo pasiti. Not true, never happened. Or, Hemis sharcha es avdi. Or Reuven goes over to Shimon. Shimon, your ox killed my eved. V'hu Omer, lo hemis. Reuven says, never happened. Osha Omer lo, avdo hipalta es, Osha Omer lo avdo, hipalta es sheni. Visimisa es enai, right? Or this is an interesting case. Remember, we'll say, what's the halacha? If you go ahead and you knock out the eye of your eved, or you knock out the tooth of your eved, what's the halacha? Your eved goes free. So now your eved comes over to you and says, you knocked out my eye, you knocked out my tooth. V'hu omer lo hepalti v'lo samisi. And ultimately, again, the master says, never happened. The nishpa. Now we'll say in all of these cases, we'll call him the defendant. The defendant swore that he did not do these things, vahoda, and then he admitted that he lied. So I'll say in all of these, a lot of different cases over here. He admitted that he lied. What's the halacha? Yachol yehe chayiv. You might have thought that he should be chayiv. Tamalomar v'kichesh ba'amito b'pikadon o b'tshomes yad o b'gezel o esek esamiso o matza aveda v'kichesh ba v'nishba al sheker. Shabbos, say, listen to this. So the Torah over here is talking about the halacha, about if a person swears falsely. So it's interesting, Shabbos say. So if you look at the cases of the Torah says as follows. The Torah says, right, v'kichesh ba'amito, you go ahead and you lie to your fellow, bipikadon, regarding something deposited with you, o b'tshomes yad, something placed in your hand, o b'gezel, or with theft, o esek, o esamiso, or you wronged your fellow, O matza aveda v'kicheshba, or you found the lost object and you denied it, v'nishpa al sheker, and then all of these cases you swore falsely. What's the common denominator amongst all these items mentioned in the pasuk? Ma'elu miyuchadin shein mamon, af kol shein mamon. Rabbi say, when is there liability for swearing falsely about something? Only when what you're swearing falsely about is mamon, is money, as opposed to what? Kinas. So yatsu elu shehin kinas. So I will say ultimately again, when is there a chiyuv for asham gzelos? Right? When is there a chiyuv for the carbon asham gzelos, for swearing falsely, for the keren and for the chomesh? Only if you're swearing falsely about mammon. But if you're swearing falsely about kinas, there is none of this liability. Amud beis, my lav bisha amad bedin. So I will say, so by the way, that has not introduced anything new to us. Jose, I just want to point out, we have two different, so remember, what we're working on right now is as follows. We introduced a new question here. Everyone is agreeing that halacha l'maisa, I shouldn't say everyone is agreeing, that's not true. Rabbi Shimon is saying that halacha l'maisa, if you went ahead and you swore falsely regarding knas, you're going to be pater. You're going to be pater, right? So remember again, that's case number one. Case number one is Reuven comes over to Shimon. Shimon, you violated my daughter, right? Shimon says, no, I didn't. Reuven says, swear. Sorry. Shimon comes over to Reuven. Reuven, you violated my daughter, right? Reuven says, no, I didn't. Shimon says, swear. Reuven says, I swear. And then what happens? Reuven admits that he did it. What does Rabbi Shimon say? Pater. Now again, the Rabbanan disagree, but Rabbi Shimon says pater. Why does Rabbi Shimon say pater? Why? Because halacha l'maisa, what is Shimon admitting to? Sorry, keep going. What is Reuven admitting to? What is he admitting to? Knas. Now, granted, there's also mammon in there, right? That's what the Rabbanan push back. I'm according to Rabbi Shimon, he's admitting to Knas. Knas pater. And therefore, again, you're not chayv on anything. You're not chayv on the Knas, you're not chayv on the carbon, you're not chayv on the carry, you're not chayv on the chomesh, you're not chayv on anything. Now, Bosig Gemara says, fine. What about case number two, where Shimon confronts Reuven with the same claim, you violated my daughter, but we went to Beis Din. Beis Din found you guilty. Right? And Reuven says, never happened. Right? I swear, never happened. Turns out Reuven says, no, I admit, I did all of these things. So now they're asking Rabbi Shimon, how do you view Knas after Beis Din has awarded the money to the plaintiff? Do we still view that money as Knas? Or no, once it's part of a judicial adjudication, in other words, once it's part of an award that Beis Din has ordered, that's transformed into mammon. And even Rabbi Shimon would agree that in that case, Reuven would be ordered to pay. So now, the Gemara brings down this case. When are you going to be chayiv ultimately again for swearing falsely? That's only in the case of mammon, but not in Knas. What case of Knas will you be pater? Says the Gemara, my lav bisha amad bedin. Aren't we even talking about a case where Beis Din delivered the verdict already? And we see that even after the verdict, Knas money is still considered to be Knas. Lo, bishalo amad bedin. No, not necessarily. In other words, we could be talking about, again, where a person is denying and then admitting to Knas. ultimately before a verdict. But perhaps after the verdict was delivered, right? If you go ahead and you deny that you owe that money, perhaps that's not called denial of knas or admittance of knas afterwards, but rather, again, that's mamon. To which the Gemara won't say, "V'hami dereisha b'sha'amad bedin, seifenai b'sha'amad bedin." But since the Reisha is talking about a case where they already had, Beis Din already made a decision, Amad Bedin. So the Seifa also has to be talking about Amad Bedin. Diktani Reisha, because what do we say in the Reisha? Ainli ela dvarim shemeshalmin aleim esakeren. Ultimately, I only know about things that you have to pay the principal. Tashlumi keifel, tashlumi arba v'chamisha, va'onis v'mfato moti shem raminayin. Ultimately, how do I know that it even includes things like keifel, arba v'chamisha? So we'll say these are all penalty payments. Ones mefata moti shemra, tamalomar, uma'ala ma'al riba. So therefore, we'll say the pasuk is ma'ala ma'al. That comes to include these cases as well. Now, what does it mean? How are you coming to include cases of kinas? Hechi dami, idelo amad bedin kfela mi'ika. Now, we'll say, now there's no such thing as kefel without a din Torah. In other words, kefel is the result of a verdict. So the Gemara says, ela pshita b'sha'amad bedin. Rather, it must be talking about a case where this particular case was already decided on by Beis Din. Umidereisha b'sha'amad bedin. And if the first part of the Mishnah is going to be, the first part of the Brayso is going to be talking about Amad bedin, Seifa nami b'sha'amad bedin. Then the Seifa must also be talking about Amad bedin, where Beis Din already reached a verdict. And therefore I will say it would appear that even after Beis Din reaches a verdict, halacha l'maisa, a knas is not called mamon. A knas is still called knas. Still called knas. Amarlei, yachilna l'shanoyu l'chareisha b'sha'amad bedin, v'seifa b'sh'lo amad bedin. So he said, the truth is, I could answer this up, and I could explain to you how the Reisha is talking about a case where they did not yet have the din Torah, and the Seifa is talking about a case where they did have the din Torah. V'kula Rabbi Shimon and I can establish the entire Brayso as according to Rabbi Shimon. V'shenuye dechike lo meshanin lecha. But I don't want to give you a stretch answer. In other words, I don't want to give you an answer that's a bit dachuk, an answer that's a bit stretched. The imkain amartali, because you could always answer back to me. Listni Reisha Rabbi Shimon Omer, or listni Seifa div Rabbi Shimon. Because if indeed that the entire Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon, then ultimately again the Mishnah should be introduced by saying Rabbi Shimon Omer, or the Mishnah should end with the words Divrei Rabbi Shimon. Ela kula b'sha'amad bedin. Rather, you have to say that the entire Mishnah is talking about a case where Beis Din already decided. Beis Din already made their psak halacha. Bereish Rabbanan v'Sefer Rabbi Shimon, and the first case has to be talking about the Rabbanan, and the first case reflects the view of the Rabbanan, and the second case reflects the view of the Sefer, reflects the view of Rabbi Shimon. Umodina lacha, and I will admit to you that halacha l'maisa, I admit to you what? I'll admit to you that knas, after a psak Beis Din, is transformed into mamon. I'll admit to you, modina lecha le'inyan karban shavua, derachmana patre mivikichesh, v'chi ka'aminan mamon havi lahorisha lebanav. Wow. Shavuot say, this is actually quite fascinating. So say, let's take a step back over here for just a moment. What are we trying to focus on over here? Right? What are we trying to focus on? We're focusing now. We have a lot of stuff going on. First of all, we have a general machlokes between Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanan. Right? What's the general machlokes Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanan? A general machlokes. So the general machlokes really goes back to the first case. The first case was, again, Shimon comes over to Ruvain, confronts Ruvain. You violated my daughter. Ruvain says, no, I didn't. Shimon says, swear. Ruvain says, I swear I didn't. Then what happens? Ruvain says, I lied. I did it. Rabbanan say, what's Ruvain's liability? Tsar, Boshes, Pegam, Knas, Chomesh, penalty fifth, Asham Gzelos. Rabbi Shimon, what does Rabbi Shimon say? Pater. Why? Because Rabbi Shimon says, there's a Knas. He admitted that he owes a Knas. Modeh b'Knas Pater. So we'll say, now Rabbi Shimon says he's Pater on everything. So the first machlokes, which we have not resolved, the first machlokes is Rabbi Shimon allows the knas to almost like eclipse all of the other monetary payments. So according to Rabbi Shimon looks at this whole thing as knas, whereas the Rabbanan say, I don't understand. There's momon and knas. Even if you want to exempt them on the knas, right? Even if he doesn't have to pay the knas, why shouldn't you have to pay tsar, boshes, pigam, maybe the penalty fifth, the asham gazelos. So that's first machlokes. Right there, Rabbi Shimon ultimately is viewing this whole thing as a knas. The Rabbanan are viewing it as a combination of mammon and knas. What's the second machlokes? The second machlokes, Rabbi say, is how, or the second point of contention, we'll call it, is after Beis Din delivers a verdict, right? So now let's say again, I will say, Reuven goes ahead. Reuven violated Rachel, right? The case goes, Shimon the father brings the case to Beis Din. Beis Din rules in favor of Rachel. So now they say, Rachel, you are entitled to Kinas, Tsar, Boshes, Pigam. Let's call it $10,000. $10,000. Beis Din says, Reuven, we hereby order you to pay Rachel $10,000. So we'll say, what's the shaila? How do you view the $10,000? Is the $10,000, is that still called Kinas and Mammon? Or maybe no, after the verdict of Beis Din, what is that called? Mammon. Now we'll say, why does that matter? That matters again because remember, case number 2 is where once again Shimon confronts Reuven and says to Reuven, you violated my daughter. And we went to Beis Din, and you're chayiv $10,000 to me. And what does Reuven say? Not true, on all counts. Reuven swears to that he's not chayiv at all. And then it turns out that what? Reuven lied. So now, halacha lemaisa, do we view Reuven as denying a knas, in which case he's pater, or the whole thing is mammon? So the Gemara just ended off also with an interesting distinction. It could very well be that legabe karban, in terms of karban, maybe we still look at this as knas, and therefore you won't be chayiv a karban or chomesh, but maybe in terms of ultimately, again, mammon, in terms of laws of inheritance, it's looked at as mammon. Look at Rashi. Lahorisha lebanav misha amad bedin umeis achlo hispik ligbos hari yishalacha velo shala. I will say maybe we look at this financial amount, this bucket, this entire bucket, as mammon, and therefore again halacha lemaisa. If the father were to die before the verdict were to be delivered, right? In accordance with the Rabbanon and the Mishnah, this entire bucket of money would pass through to the brothers because we view the whole thing as mammon. In other words, maybe we view it as mammon for certain things, but not mammon as other things. Eisir Shimon Omer, Imlo speak a ligbos achem sa'av harein shalatzma. So we'll say this is the Mishnah. Right? Rabbi Shimon says if she did not have the opportunity, I should say, to go ahead and if the money was not collected by the father before the father died, harein shalatzma. Rabbi says Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah. Right? Rabbi Shimon says the money does not become the property of the father until he collects it. Therefore, if the father dies before collection, the money becomes the property of the girl. So the Gemara says, "Shatzma fi amrit maman havi la risha labanav liatzma amai da'achin by mihavi." But if it's just said before that maybe this money can be considered mammon for inheritance purposes, if that's the case, then why does the girl get it? Why wouldn't the brothers inherit? In other words, as long as the father is alive at the beginning of the proceedings, then this bucket of money should be called mammon, at least for inheritance purposes, and let her brothers inherit it, not her. Amar Rava said, "Hai milsa kashay ba Rabba v'Rav Yosef esrin v'tartin shnei." Rabba says incredible. Rabba says this matter was a kasha, was difficult for Rabba and Rav Yosef for 22 years. V'lo ifrik, and they never were able to answer it. Ad Yosef Rav Yosef bereisha opirka, until Rav Yosef came and was Rosh Yeshiva and ultimately answered. I both say, take a look at Rashi. It's actually an incredible Rashi. Esrin v'tartin shnein. It's right across and Tosfos low. Listen to this. Hein hayu yimeis rarasol shal Rabba. Rabba was Rosh Yeshiva for 22 years. Umeis, and then he died. The Yasha Rav Yosef Barosh. When Rav Yosef was made Rosh Yeshiva, Rabba says, listen to this. V'sayua min hashamayim lefarki lios lo l'shem lefishay Rabba charif v'lakach karu oker harim. Rabba said, listen to this. When Rav Yosef became the Rosh Yeshiva, this is incredible. People didn't know if he was really up for the task. Because Rabba was Rabba, and Rav Yosef came along, and people were like, okay. So we'll say, so what happened? A miracle occurred. Rav Yosef had certain siyata d'shmaya that on his first day on the job as Rosh Yeshiva, he was able to resolve certain halachic issues which were outstanding for over 2 decades. And I will say, this is one of them. On the first day of the job, he resolved this question that was outstanding for 22 years. She's supposed to say, look at the end of Rashi. Rashi says, over v'lakach karu oker harim. We'll say, Rabbah was called an oker harim. Oker harim means what? An uprooter of mountains. And we'll say, oker harim, that term is used for someone with an incredibly a deep intellect, someone who's able to look at things critically and ask profound questions. And really, Okera means someone who possesses a keen power of analysis. That was Rabbah. Rav Yosef was not an Oker Harim. What was Rav Yosef? I was looking at Rashi. Rav Yosef haya bal shmuos mishnah braisa. Rav Yosef was an encyclopedia. And therefore what? Lakach karua Sinai. They called him Sinai. I will say Sinai is the term that's used for someone who possesses a voluminous amount of knowledge. We'll have to stop over here for today. So I'm going to stop over here. I'm going to leave you on the cliffhanger with the question. I'll just point out that people had doubts about Rav Yosef because he wasn't a Sinai. He wasn't an Oker, he was a Sinai. Therefore, he has Siyata D'Shmaya on the first day of the job. The Kadosh Baruch Hu allowed him to go ahead and resolve certain issues which were outstanding for over 2 decades. We'll say the resolution, Emir Hashem tomorrow, Shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a great day, everyone.